Well, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as you know, is in Tel Aviv. He's met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's speaking now at the airport. Let's listen in.
As I did as well in my conversations with Egyptian colleagues and the Qatari Foreign Ministry yesterday. I also had a chance to meet with the hostage families again. And it's hard to describe what they're going through every single day. We made progress in the last couple of weeks on the hostage negotiations, closing gaps, but almost by definition, when you get down to the last items, they tend to be the hardest. So there's still a lot of work to be done, hard work to be done, but we're determined to try to get it done. We also talked about the imperative of surging and sustaining humanitarian assistance for the people in Gaza. 100% of the population of Gaza is acutely food insecure. 100% is in need of humanitarian assistance. There have been some positive steps taken in recent days to improve the situation, but it's not enough. And we talked about what needs to happen to get much more assistance to many more people more effectively. We also talked about Rafah. We share Israel's goal of defeating Hamas, which is responsible for the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And we share the goal of ensuring Israel's long-term security. As we've said, though, a major military ground operation in Rafah is not the way to do it. It risks killing more civilians. It risks wreaking greater havoc with the provision of humanitarian assistance. It risks further isolating Israel around the world and jeopardizing its long-term security and standing. So we're looking forward to having Israeli officials in Washington next week to talk about a different way of achieving these objectives that we share, of defeating Hamas and ensuring Israel's long-term security. It really requires an integrated humanitarian, military, and political plan. As I said, we'll be talking about that next week, going through the details of what we see as the best way forward. We also had an opportunity to talk about the longer-term trajectory. What needs to happen once the conflict in Gaza is over. Conversations that I had with our Arab partners over the last couple of days and that we had here in Israel as well. We're determined that Israel succeed in making sure it can defend itself, that October 7th never happens again, that it emerge from this strong, secure, integrated in the region with a future of security and peace, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians and for our other friends in the region. And we believe there's a path forward to do that. We'll be continuing to work to flesh out that path and to try to walk down it in the days and weeks ahead.
Amira? Mr. Secretary, thank you. Can you give us an update on the ceasefire talks in Doha? What is the latest that you've heard from the negotiators? And also today, Israel has announced a land seizure of 800 hectares in the occupied West Bank just when you are doing your visit here. What are your thoughts?
So on the negotiations, I can't give you any more details other than to say that we're intensely engaged in them, working with the Qataris, working with the Egyptians, working with Israel. And we have teams in Doha. And as I said, we've gotten it down to a few remaining gaps, but the closer you get to the goal line, the harder that last yard is. So there are some hard issues to work through, but we're determined to do everything we can to get there and to get people home. And the negotiators will be working intensely to see if we can get that done. I hadn't seen the news you referred to, but look, you know our views on settlement expansion. You know our views on everything from demolitions to evictions to other steps, unilateral steps that are taken that make the already challenging prospect of two states even more distant. So I haven't seen the specifics of this, but anyone taking steps that makes things more difficult, more challenging this time, it's something that we have a problem with.
one tiny clarification. When you say we have teams, you mean U.S. has teams on the ground in Doha today, and can you just confirm the negotiations have begun, like they've been continuing this?
I can't. It should be going forward, if not immediately now, certainly in the hours ahead.
Michael, Todd? Thank you. Can you tell us in practical terms what the U.S. was trying to achieve with the resolution that was put forward at the United Nations today? And then on your conversations today, you described in broad strokes some themes that are familiar. I wonder whether you delivered or heard any messages today that are new and different from your past conversations here.
So on the resolution, which got very strong support, but then was cynically vetoed by Russia and China, I think we were trying to show the international community's sense of urgency about getting a ceasefire tied to the release of hostages, something that everyone, including the countries that vetoed the resolution, should have been able to get behind. The resolution, of course, also condemned Hamas. It's unimaginable why countries wouldn't be able to do that. But I think the fact that we got such a strong vote, despite the veto by two of the permanent members of the Security Council, again, is evidence and demonstration of the commitment, the conviction of countries around the world, notably on the Security Council, to see about getting the ceasefire and getting the release of hostages now. That's what the resolution said. That's what it called for. And I think it showed that a strong commitment to that from many, many countries. With regard to the conversations we had, look, this is an ongoing process. As I said, we really were focused on three things: the hostage negotiations, humanitarian assistance, and Rafah. And it was important that, again, we focus on all three things. I'm not going to get into the details of what we discussed, but I think from my perspective at least, these were important, candid conversations to have at a critical time on all three of those issues. Thanks.
That it will be isolated if it doesn't change its path?
Again, what I shared, and I think what they've heard from President Biden as well, directly, is we have the same goals: the defeat of Hamas, Israel's long-term security. But a major ground operation in Rafah is not, in our judgment, the way to achieve it. And we've been very clear about that. But most important, we have a senior team coming to Washington next week. We'll all be taking part in those discussions. We'll be able to lay out for them in detail. I started to do that today, but it's important that the teams with all the expertise lay out in detail how those goals can best be accomplished with an integrated humanitarian, military, and political plan. We'll put all that on the table. Of course, we'll hear from them too, and we'll take it to next week. Thanks.
Well, you've been listening there to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking in Tel Aviv after meeting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier on Friday. Now, he said that progress is being made on negotiations in Doha. They've gotten it down, he said, to a few remaining gaps, but there is still some way to go. Blinken also says that he pressed the need to increase humanitarian aid and warned Israel against its planned offensive in Rafah. He says they also discussed long-term plans, including the integration of Israel in the region. Well, let's now go to Hamda Salhut. She's in occupied East Jerusalem, keeping an eye on this visit for us. Hamda, there are still clearly some broad differences of opinion between Blinken and Netanyahu.
That's exactly right. There have been disagreements between American and Israeli officials for some months now, specifically when it comes to this ground invasion in Rafah. Netanyahu, in fact, speaking earlier today, saying that the ground invasion will happen with or without U.S. support, that if it doesn't come with U.S. support, Israel will be forced to do it alone. The Americans have actually asked the Israelis, at the request of U.S. President Joe Biden, to send a delegation to Washington to brief them on plans of how exactly this ground invasion is going to work, with nearly 1.5 million Palestinians seeking refuge in Gaza's southernmost city. Earlier today, you also had the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, who said that there is nowhere for these Palestinian civilians in Rafah to go to. And then we just heard from Blinken, who said that this is a war that will require humanitarian, political, and military type of thinking, not just one way, which Netanyahu Netanyahu says is military pressure. So the continued disputes between American and Israeli officials are quite prevalent. Now, when it comes to these negotiations in Doha, Blinken is saying that there is progress, and the last bit of it is always the hardest, these final sticking points. But during the same hour, Israeli officials speaking anonymously to Israeli media have said, quote, that there is no real progress in these talks, and that's because of sticking points from both sides, with that Hamas wanting to see an end to the war and the Israelis saying that even if there is a long pause in the fighting, the war will continue after that, especially when it comes to this ground invasion into Rafah that is seemingly causing now some problems between the Americans and their Israeli counterparts.
Hamda Salhut keeping an eye on that Blinken visit for us in Israel. Thank you very much, Hamda. Well, I'm joined now again on set by our diplomatic editor, James Bays. James, I'm curious about what you made of Blinken's tone, because as we heard from Hamda, literally earlier after that meeting with Netanyahu walked out and said he's going to go ahead with his Rafah offensive with or without Washington's support. But now we've literally got Blinken getting on a plane at the airport saying, oh, no, they're still trying to convince them.
I'm afraid to say that Secretary of State Blinken's comments were exactly the same comments as he made before he started the trip, when he arrived in Cairo, and as he was leaving, he said the same thing. He hasn't changed the script. But what really went on in the meeting, I think, will be very, very interesting, because there are big problems between Israel and the United States right now. There is the problems of the Rafah offensive, which clearly is the number one problem. The US says that should not happen, and the Israelis say it's going to happen whatever. If you support us, fine. If not, we're going to go ahead anyway. There's the problem of humanitarian aid. If that resolution had passed today, there are sections in that resolution really very critical of Israel. They didn't name Israel, but they did say that there need to be lifting of all the barriers to international aid, many more crossing points, a maritime route into Gaza, all of things that aren't happening because Israel is not allowing them to happen. And then with regard to the way forward longer term, Israel opposes the presence of the Palestinian Authority to run Gaza. That is the US's preferred solution. Israel opposes the idea of a two-state solution. And add on to that the fact that now we're in a position where the United States is in a really difficult position at the UN Security Council. They've flagged the idea that they support the idea of a ceasefire, even though their resolution, many say, wasn't really a proper explicit demand for a ceasefire. So they now may well be in a position that they're going to have to either abstain or vote for a resolution for a ceasefire, creating yet another obstacle and problem between the Netanyahu administration and the Biden administration.
Well, interesting dynamics there. I wish we had a little bit more insight into them. James Bays, our diplomatic editor, thank you for joining me again on this News Hour.